right. Hello, everybody. Good afternoon, good evening, good night from wherever you may be joining us. Thank you for your punctuality. We will be starting in just a second. I'm just letting everybody finish joining in here from the waiting room. Okie dokie. I think that's it. So, Sean, go right ahead.
Okay, thank you, Andres. Hi, everyone. I'm Sean MacDonald. I'm the CEO of Verité. Verité is a civil society organization that promotes fair, safe, and legal work in supply chains worldwide. And on behalf of Verité, I'm extending a warm welcome to all of you joining us here today to learn more about the responsible sourcing tools, due diligence, and risk management tools for the transportation sector. Today is the second webinar in a three-part series, and I hope that you will all join us for our third final webinar next Wednesday, September 24th, for practical training on how to apply these tools in your workplace. I have had the privilege of collaborating with the U.S. Department of Transportation's counter-trafficking initiative over the last few years through United Nations Working Group on Air Operator Supply Chains, and then last year when Verité was invited to brief the department's Advisory Committee on Human Trafficking all about responsible sourcing. The U.S. Department of Transportation's Statutory Committee makes triennial recommendations to the Secretary of Transportation on improving counter-trafficking efforts across the transportation sector. To date, both iterations of the committee have highlighted the need for improving understanding of the risks associated with labor trafficking in the transportation sector, including supply chains, operations, and staffing, and also recommending the implementation of due diligence practices and tools that ensure ethical business practices to actively prevent and mitigate the risk of forced labor. The U.S. Department of Transportation contracted Verité to address these needs, building off our bench of expertise and long-standing work with the U.S. Department of State on the responsible sourcing tool, and to develop sector-specific tools and new commodity reports to enhance counter-trafficking efforts for companies and professionals working across the aviation, maritime, pipelines, private vehicles, rail, transit, and trucking industries. There's a lot within the transport sector, and we are addressing the needs of all these different parts. The transportation entities operate within an increasingly stringent regulatory environment that demands proactive measures to prevent human trafficking. Just a few of those regulations include the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, the Tariff Act, the Trade Facilitation and Trade Enforcement Act, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, the U.S.-Mexico-Canada Agreement, the Buy American Act, and the Build America, Buy America Act, as well as regulations such as the Federal Acquisition Regulation, combating trafficking in persons. Plus, there are various other state-level requirements that establish clear expectations for businesses to monitor and address trafficking risks within their operations and supply chains. The launch of the responsible sourcing tool for the transportation sector is therefore very timely and intended to support public and private transportation entities, government contractors, supply chain managers, procurement and sustainability professionals, and compliance officers who wish to better prevent, identify, and address human trafficking, including forced labor, in their global supply chains, and to develop effective risk management systems. I would like to extend heartfelt thanks to my team at Verité, the staff at the U.S. Department of Transportation, the Department of Transportation's Transportation Leaders Against Human Trafficking partners who informed this effort, and their collective impact in combating human trafficking across the transportation sector. Now I'd like to introduce my colleagues who will walk you through the transportation sector resources. Michael Vaudrell is a Senior Director at Verité, as well as Ali Arbib, who's a Research Director. They will later be joined by Lydia Long, who's also a Senior Director at Verité, who will be managing the questions via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Thank you, and over to you, Michael.
Great, thank you, Sean. Glad to be here, and thank you for joining, everybody. This is a very brief agenda. We just went through introductions, and I'll be going over the responsible sourcing tool website at a fairly high level. I'll then hand it over to Ali, who will get into some of the research that she and others at Verité did for human trafficking risks in the transportation sector. She'll hand it back to me, and I'll go over some of the the tools, the due diligence tools that Sean mentioned on the website, and then we'll open it up for questions at the end. Very briefly, Sean gave a great overview of Verité, but this is just a little bit more about us. We've been around for about 30 years, providing consulting, research, and assessment services to both government and the private sector. We're probably best known for our work in forced labor and child labor. And all the tools, research, and other information that you'll find on the responsiblesourcingtool.org website is based on those 30 years of work with multinational corporations and governments. So I'm going to look now at the Responsible Sourcing Tool website. If you've been on any of these webinars previously, you may have a general idea of how things or organize the site, which we developed about 10 years ago now with the Department of State, and most recently, obviously, working with the Department of Transportation. It provides tools and a number of other resources for government agencies and private companies to, both understand the issues of forced labor, identify where those can be found, and then finally, to prevent and remediate forced labor risk in operations and in supply chains. The QR code that you see on the screen will take you directly to the site. And all of the risk information on the site comes from several different areas, comes from Verité's own field research, desk research, and our experience in doing assessments and consultation. Also comes from the annual State Department tip report and from the Department of Labor list of goods produced with forced or child labor. The way the site is organized is that there are three main pillars that make it easier for you to find your way around. The first is understanding, and that is if an organization doesn't really have a good knowledge, or if you need more information on the nature of forced labor and human trafficking risks, this is where you can find it. The second pillar allows the user to identify forced labor risk by industry, commodity, and source countries. So if you're an organization, let's say a manufacturer of transportation equipment that's trying to find out where there could be forced labor risks in your various supply chains, this identify pillar is the great place to start out. And then finally, the third pillar that I'll cover at the end of the presentation is the prevent and address, which is where we get into the due diligence tools that organizations can use to assess risks in their own operations and their supply chains, and to develop a strategy to prevent issues or to mitigate the likelihood of something happening. So beginning with the understand pillar, this is a very quick overview. The first thing it gives you is information on the risks in the sector relative to the product or the commodity that an organization may be purchasing, how that material, how that product is produced or made. And then finally, on the nature of the workforce. For example, is it a product or a commodity that relies on low-skilled labor, where the work is what we call 3D work, dirty, dangerous, and demeaning? It also then gives information on the geographic risk. Geographic risk associated with a country, such as the rule of law. Does the country have a strong legal framework? If it does, is it well enforced? And also, what are the socioeconomic conditions? And then finally, labor risks related to geography. So, for example, how vulnerability to forced labor can be influenced by poverty, by refugee status, and other factors that are related to geography. Identify is an incredibly useful part of the site because it contains risk maps that really enable the user to visually link where forced labor risk are present in an organization's supply chains. And users can access the information by sector, by commodity, and by country. So let's look at transportation as an example. So the first thing you would do is, if you're looking at transportation sector risk, is click on transportation, and that what that would give you immediately then is below this, which is not shown on the screen, unfortunately, is a profile of the transportation sector. There's a paragraph or two that describes the general risks in that industry, and then it links you to the sector report for, in this case, the transportation sector, which contains very detailed information on the risks that are present across the entire sector, as well as to the, or specific to the different modes within the transportation sector. And Ali will get into that in a little bit. You can then select a commodity, in this case, aluminum, a very commonly used material, obviously in the transportation sector. And once you do that, you're able to see a short description of forced labor risks associated with aluminum, and not just in transportation, but aluminum that could be used obviously in any sector. Down below again, which you can't see, there would be access, you would have access to we're calling a commodity report. So a specific report dealing with the forced labor issues associated with, in this case, aluminum. Now, you can then go to select a country. In this case, we'll select China. And when you do that, like the others, there's now a profile for the country, which summarizes the forced labor risk associated with that country. And also, you can get very detailed country risk indicators. This is an example of the ones for China. The country-based indicators on the right, you can see that they're listed from high risk to very low risk. And all of those risk ratings are developed by the organizations that actually generate those indices, whether it's the Freedom House for the Civil Liberties rating or ILO for the composite score. You name it, though, there is a way to rank the risk, which an organization can use in putting together a risk profile of their suppliers, their supply chains, their sourcing countries. And as Sean mentioned, there's a third webinar coming up next week, and that's when we will get into it in quite a bit of depth on how you map your supply chain, how you rank the risks of the countries that you're sourcing from, your suppliers, so that you can then prioritize your supply chain for additional risk prevention work. At this point, I'm going to hand it over to Ali, who will take us through the risks in the sector based on all of the research that she and the team done. Ali, go ahead.
Thank you, Michael. Yeah, so thank you. Thanks everyone for being here. Yeah, so as Michael said, I'm going to talk more about some of the specific findings, what it looks like. And I'll start just by sort of talking a little bit more about the scope of the research that's included in the report. So obviously, if we're thinking about the transportation sector, that is a broad sector. So as Michael mentioned, that includes everything all the way up from the mining of the minerals that go into metals and the processing of those minerals, the way up to component manufacturing, to assembling of planes, trains, automobiles, but also operations. So also people doing work, more like service work in the transportation sector and across a wide variety of modes of transportation. So, automotive and road transport, trains, aviation, maritime transport. So we tried to take a comprehensive and holistic look and really consider consider both the supply chain as well as the operations type labor involved. And so in each of those, we tried to pick out, so because that's such a, often when we're doing a reporting on a sector, it's a little bit more narrow. So we really wanted to be thoughtful about, once we had conducted all that research, about pulling out some of the key themes and trends we were finding, especially today, to be able to present it to you. So go to the next slide and I'll talk a little bit more about that. So first, I want to take a moment. I think probably many of you are familiar with the definition of forced labor, and we could spend a whole other hour talking about international definitions and legal definitions of forced labor and human trafficking. But when we're thinking about it in practice at its most basic level, it's someone working a job that they didn't freely consent to and they can't freely leave. So there was something about the mechanisms that brought them into that job that they could not freely agree to. It was not of their free will. And then there's something that is coercing them or preventing them from leaving. And that can be um, a variety of mechanisms, but there are always some mechanisms of control and coercion. And this goes for all forms and forced labor and human trafficking in all sectors, that this isn't transport sector specific, but I think it's important to name them and to be sort of familiar with them. And then as we go through some of the case studies and examples, I think that you'll see how these really come into play. Certainly deception and recruitment and hiring, that's a really critical one that will come up in nearly all of the case studies. And that affects the degree to which someone is able to freely take on a job, to enter a job. Debt manipulation, so debt often arising from recruitment fees, hiring fees, costs to get into a job, but as well sometimes costs that people incur once they're already in a job, costs that typically they weren't aware of also. Intimidation by an employer or a third party, someone who's been involved in their recruitment or hiring, some form of intimidation, threat, harassment, particularly to compel them to keep working. And this certainly is something that we see that is more for populations that may already be vulnerable in one way or another, may already be marginalized in one way or another. Depending on the context, they're certainly more vulnerable to threats, intimidation, harassment. Whenever we see restricted freedom of movement or isolation in a work site, sometimes it's inherent just where the nature of the work site is. Being out in the middle of the ocean, when we're talking about transport, there is some inherent restriction of freedom of movement that can be abused, that can be taken advantage of, that can be different than someone working at an airport potentially. So we see these, I won't go through all of these in great detail, but I think that gives a really, that's an overview of some of these mechanisms of control that we see come up over and over again. And then we tried, for this presentation in the report, we tried to pull out other sort of themes that were specific to the transport sector that we were seeing coming up multiple times. So for my part of the presentation, I'm going to go through each of these and give some examples of what they look like in practice based on our research. So the first one is the use of labor agents, subcontractors, or other forms of outsourced labor. Predatory leasing and contracting arrangements, particularly here, this often comes up around truck drivers or other drivers, state-sponsored forced labor, and risks in the extended supply chain. Next slide, please. All right, so starting with the use of subcontracted or outsourced forced labor. So this is something, again, this is not transport or transportation specific by any means. Many companies in a variety of sectors, and this in the transport sector, even this, we see it in multiple tiers of the supply chain, from raw materials all the way up to operations. But companies are using some form of third-party intermediaries. So whether it's labor agents, recruiters, staffing agencies, to handle some part of the employment life cycle. So whether that's recruiting, hiring, or overseeing workers in the workplace. So they're sort of outsourcing key business functions. And if the outsourced intermediary is overseeing something like age verification, regulatory compliance, you can see how that could cause some problems pretty quickly. Sometimes these workers hired by a contract or agency aren't always included in the the sort of downstream company's code of conduct and due diligence commitments and oversight. So they're not necessarily able to access the same rights and protections and grievance mechanisms as workers who are hired directly. We saw this playing, and also often when the intermediaries are involved in the recruitment, we see this debt cycle where the recruiters are making promises, you're going to get this great job, you're going to be paid so much money. The worker signs, agrees to the job, they arrive on site. As it turns out, they need to borrow money, they need to take on loans, advances, they take on debt. The wages that they earn are not the wages they're promised. They're not able to pay off the debt. There's typically some form of threats or coercion, which are compounding risk, and the cycle continues. So we see this play out across a variety of sectors and modes of transportation, including auto manufacturing in the US, which I'll speak to in more detail in a moment. Actually, in-flight catering workers, there was a really interesting case study in Canada where workers from other countries were being recruited by a third-party recruitment firm to work for in-flight catering companies. They were promised permits, they were promised legal jobs in Canada. When they arrived in Canada, they were not given work permits, so they had no other way to find alternate employment. They were paid, their wages were paid by the recruitment company, not the catering company directly. They were paid less than they were promised. I believe in many cases, actually illegal sub-minimum wages. They weren't given proper training, benefits. They faced threats of deportation to sort of maintain their compliance and not be able to make a complaint. So you can see how this can quickly spiral. And if a company doesn't have insight into what their contractors are doing on their behalf, there can be a real gap in oversight and compliance. All right. We also saw this in shipbuilding and in cruise lines. We'll talk about cruise lines in a moment, but I think it's good to note that anytime we're talking about maritime work, including cruise workers, which do use a very high percentage of international workers, you have to consider that factor of isolation. Once someone's at sea, it can be very difficult. And there are many recruiting agencies that really specialize in placing workers on cruise lines. So it's something to be aware of. Next slide, please. So thinking about the use of some contracted or outsourced labor in one specific case study, many of you we've got the headlines up here. This is something probably many people saw the headlines or aware of these stories. What was happening was that there were recruiters that were working directly to engage and to try to recruit children through informal networks, sometimes social media or community connections. These children were being contacted directly, being promised job opportunities as a way to earn money, to support families. These children were finding ways to borrow money to pay recruitment fees to travel to the United States. So they getting to the United States already in debt. Their recruiters helped them obtain forged identification papers so they could work despite being underage. They were sometimes living in situations that were controlled by their recruiters through one mechanism or another. And then they were being placed in automotive plants, and these are children as young as 13. So essentially, once they had traveled nearly every aspect of their life, where they lived, their work, the terms and conditions they worked under were under the control of the recruitment agency, not the auto manufacturing plant. The auto manufacturing plants did not hire them directly. It was the recruitment and staffing firms. And this is really this highlights a trend that there has been, there's evidence of some increase in child labor. I think the US Department of Labor has documented nearly a 90% increase of child labor in the United States that's in violation of federal law since 2019. And also just to say, certainly not isolated to auto manufacturing in a variety of sectors. And for the purposes of this webinar, I think it's important to know or helpful to know maybe other services that sometimes intersect with the transportation sectors where illegal child labor has also been observed. So for example, janitorial service is not directly transport work, but there is janitorial work that is contracted out at bus stations, at airports, at many places that intersect where janitorial work is done. So it's just helpful to be aware of things like kitchens, food processing, housekeeping, in the tourism industry, which certainly intersects with the transportation industry. Next slide, please. I think I I got a little bit ahead of myself. I think I was really eager to talk about the in-flight catering example on my first slide. But I think another potential case study to talk about is shipbuilding. So the use of subcontracted or outsourced labor has come up and has been documented in a number of contexts in shipbuilding specifically. So there have been social audits and reporting on those social audits that have documented workers from other countries where their passports have been withheld. They pay recruitment fees. They're subject to really restricted freedom of movements. This is in shipbuilding. This has been documented in shipbuilding in the Middle East and Asia, as well as to some degree in the United States. There have been stories about workers denied protections that they should otherwise be provided in the US. So not necessarily rising to the level of forced labor, but workers that have been misclassified and denied core labor rights. So because of as a result of being hired by outsourced labor. So something certainly to be aware of in terms of compliance. Ship breaking is another interesting example. I don't have a little picture for it, but there is evidence that essentially human trafficking happens where Bangladeshi adult children and Indian migrants working have been found to essentially be in forced labor because of manipulation of debt. And then cruise lines, we talked about that briefly. A 2024, there's a really large number, particularly of foreign workers, particularly a large percentage of Filipino workers who are hired via these third-party hiring partners. There's often misleading contracts, some form of a fee repayment scheme. And once they're on the cruise lines, again, isolation, lack of communication, and really long work hours. Another example at sea is commercial shipping. So a 2024 study found that over nearly a third of seafarers that were surveyed reported that they had been asked to pay recruitment fees to secure their employment. And nearly half of those workers that were charged recruitment fees reported paying amounts that were up to $5,000. Some, I think, reported fees as high as 10,000 US dollars. So that really on the earnings they were making could take a long time to pay off. Next slide, please. I think, so the next theme that we saw is what we're calling predatory leasing and contracting. So essentially this is independent operators, or people who think they're going to be independent operators, are promised the ability to operate independently and then sort of trapped. They're not given accurate information and are essentially trapped in conditions where they're not able to make the decisions and have the degree of control over their employment that they were promised. So one example is in the trucking industry. Many truck drivers participate in what's called lease purchase programs. And the estimates I've seen, there's a wide range of estimates of how many truck drivers this impacts in the US. I've seen anywhere from 200,000 to 400,000, but it's a significant number of drivers. So there are these lease to own agreements, which can span 3 to 5 years, in which the drivers are financing trucks from motor carriers. So they're essentially taking out loans or advances to finance these trucks. They're promised that they'll be able to cover the lease payments and expenses while working towards truck ownership, which seems like a great idea, and that they'll be able to set their own schedules. They'll be able to essentially be in control of how much money they're making at any one time. As it turns out, the carriers themselves are controlling assignments, which dictates how much truck drivers can earn. The carriers are setting terms for things like fuel surcharges, insurance, where truck drivers can get their truck to works on, which parts they can purchase. And the truck drivers don't know this in advance. So all of those things are essentially deducted from their earnings. And once all those deductions are taken out, the earnings are very, very little. Many end up in debt even after their payment. there's reports of drivers having to work essentially over 20 hours a day just to cover their expenses. And so, and then on top of that, they can also be penalized for small issues. And many end up actually getting their trucks repossessed even after all the money they've put into it. So then they have truly no way of paying back the debt that they're in. Next slide, please. The next theme that we see coming up is state-sponsored forced labor. So this is 14% of global forced labor that's imposed by governments. It includes labor as a punishment, discipline, or economic development. It includes forced prison labor and compulsory labor transfer schemes. The Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region of China, it's really a focal point for state-sponsored forced labor and what is referred to as labor transfers. And workers working under these programs are under really strict surveillance, extremely restricted freedom of movement. It's sometimes referred to as vocational training, but there's no free will involved in this type of labor. And so products coming out of this region in China, certainly state-sponsored forced labor is not limited to this region, but in transportation supply chains, there are a number of products that intersect, that are used in transport supply chains, that in one way or another, at least have the potential of being implicated or being produced in this region. So for example, products including steel, aluminum, lithium, copper, rubber, there's a number of products that have been identified as having risk stemming from at least some level of production in this region, even all the way up to things like train shells and rail car components. In May of 2025, US Customs and Border Control agents confiscated train shells and rail car components that had been shipped from China by a Beijing-based company that were associated with production in this region. Next slide, please. So we'll talk a little bit more, so there are other examples of the way that state-sponsored forced labor can play out in transport supply chains. One, interestingly, and I didn't actually know this before working on this report, was the instance of Cuban workers employed on cruise lines. So they're employed and hired through government agencies in Cuba. They're not directly employed by the cruise lines, essentially. So the government is involved in all aspects of their employment arrangements. The workers retain only a small percentage of their wages, the rest being remitted to the Cuban government. So they're not able to leave the vessel. They can't terminate their contract without incurring huge penalties. There can be document passport withholding. So workers who don't return to Cuba, that's certainly not an option. So they're separated for a long time from their family, and often essentially just without any form of recourse once they're on the vessels. Other interesting places that you wouldn't necessarily think of, one product that has been cited as associated with production, forced labor production in China, is batteries, electric bus batteries. So there's battery factories in eastern and southern China that use relocated Uyghur workers under the labor transfer program, which was something that, wouldn't necessarily think of bus batteries specifically. And finally, just thinking about the extended supply chain as a place within a wide number of transport sector modes to be aware of. So in addition to the operations or to the manufacture, the auto manufacturing itself, looking at the very bottom of global supply chains. We know, and if some of you joined us last week, for our webinar on mining and risks of forced labor and human trafficking in the mining sector. We know that mining is a very high-risk activity. It's often a very dangerous job that can rely on workers with very few other options. It's incredibly hazardous. It takes place in really remote locations often. And the minerals that go into various transport products is something to be aware of. So these are really complex supply chains in hazardous industries. This often gets termed, some of these jobs at the bottom of the supply chain sometimes get termed low skill labor. It's not low skill, it's very dangerous, but it is often poorly compensated, poorly regulated, weak oversight, weak enforcement because of the environments in which it's occurring. So mining certainly is one key place to look at. Electronics and electronics components and manufacturing is another upstream area of the extended supply chain to be aware of. Electronics components go in pretty much everything. They're in, if you try to buy a fridge, they're in a fridge. And we know that in multiple key origin countries where electronics and electronics components are manufactured have been implicated with forced labor. So if we just thinking about some examples of this, thinking about the amount of aluminum that's used in various modes in the transport industry. So aluminum processing, multi-stage process, and involves bauxite ore extraction. A lot of that takes place in Guinea. I think nearly a quarter of the world's extraction of bauxite comes out of Guinea. And while forced labor specifically hasn't been really authoritatively documented in Guinea, a number of other human rights abuses have been around bauxite extraction. It's then refined into alumina, it's smelted into aluminum, which is then rolled into components. It's used in cars, aircraft bodies, vehicle panels. And also, in addition to that mining in Guinea, about nearly 10%, I think, of the world's aluminum is produced in the regions of China of concern. So that is certainly something of note. Rubber is another one. So there have been links of natural rubber to forced labor, but the majority of the rubber used in the tire industry is synthetic rubber. And there are companies that have producing synthetic rubber for tire manufacturing operated in regions of concern in China. So that is something that has been, and tire manufacturers specifically have been utilizing those labor transfer programs. Looking at other specialized metals, things like magnesium alloys, 90% of global production of the metals using these alloys occurs in China and Russia. So I think just the awareness to know that when a transport company is considering their risk and where in the supply chain to look, certainly looking all the way up to through the extended supply chain to minerals is important. Okay, I will wrap it up there and I will hand it back to Michael.
Great. Thanks, Ellie. Great summary. Okay, so now that we have at least a high level understanding of some of the significant forced labor risks in the sector, the question obviously is, what can an organization do about that to reduce the risk and to address any harms that may have occurred? And that really is the purpose of the third pillar of the RST. That's the prevent pillar. And what it contains, as you can see in this diagram, is a set of 12 tools that together comprise a supply chain due diligence process. And that's really the whole purpose of the RST website, is to help organizations get to the point where they can put together an effective way to understand, identify, prevent, and address forced labor risks in their own operations and in their supply chains. The diagram here is kind of loosely aligned with the OECD due diligence guidance and with the UN guiding principles, but essentially it includes tools that range from creating a code of conduct all the way to how do you ensure compliance with, if you're a government contractor, the federal acquisition regulation. So tool one, the overview of a supply chain, the actual description of a due diligence program. I'll get into more detail in a few minutes. Tool two is a sample code of conduct. This is what embeds respect for human rights, for prevention of forced labor into the way a company does business, and is something that becomes part of contracts and purchase requisitions with suppliers. Tool three are performance benchmarks. So those are the things that you would measure a supplier's performance against. Are they living up to the commitments in the code of conduct? These essentially are audit criteria or assessment criteria. Tool four helps an organization understand what the regulatory environment is in their sourcing countries and countries of operation. Questions that you can look at in terms of what is the regulatory environment of those countries, and as a foundation for developing a heat map or a risk map of an organization's supply chain. Tool five is a sample supplier agreement, so it's a formality where a supplier would acknowledge that they understand and will work to conform to a company's code requirements. Tool six, which we will cover in great detail next week in the third webinar, is a tool to enable supply chain mapping and risk assessment. So how does an organization go about gathering the information it needs about what it sources, from whom and from where, so that it can prioritize risks for further assessment and for prevention and mitigation activities. Tool seven is a tool for screening labor agents before selecting them. Ali covered in great detail the types of issues that can crop up when you use agents, and we'll cover that in a few minutes with a discussion specifically of Tool 7. Tool 8 is a general supplier self-assessment that an organization can use with any supplier as they're trying to decide what supplier to use for a given purpose, to source a specific service or product, to understand their capabilities and willingness to conform to your requirements. Tool 9 complements Tool 7, and that is, once you have a labor agent, a recruitment agent, staffing agent on board, is how do you measure their ongoing performance in meeting your requirements and regulatory requirements. Tool 10 is a guide for interviewing workers, and this is absolutely essential for an organization to verify that risks have truly been prevented, or that any harm that's incurred, such as workers having paid fees or having had their identity documents confiscated, it's a way of verifying that those issues have been satisfactorily taken care of. Tool 11 is something that covers ways to engage with workers to gather information that can help you understand where there may be issues in the way you're managing the risks of forced labor, to receive grievance reports from workers where there have been or they're alleged to have been violations of their rights, and essentially ways to make workers part of the process of preventing forced labor risks. And finally, Tool 12 is a somewhat specialized one. If you're a contractor to the federal government, the US government, and the contract is over a certain dollar amount, you're required to put together a compliance plan for preventing forced labor and trafficking in persons, and Tool 12 shows you how to do that. Okay, so let's look at Tool 1. Again, Tool 1 is kind of the center of the universe here when we're talking about the due diligence process. It really describes from a company's perspective, it's written from a company's perspective or an organization's perspective of this is how we assess and address risks in our supply chain. And all of the tools in the tool set, tools 2 through 12, are elements of this, of tool 1. It's written with scope and objectives. What are we trying to do? Who is accountable for implementing this due diligence process? Who's responsible for implementing it? How the company will go about mapping its supply chain, how risk will be assigned, how prioritization will be assigned based on risk, and how contractors will be selected and selected and engaged. Also, it gets into how audits should be conducted of suppliers, agencies, and service providers, how a company responds to any issues that are identified during an audit, from a grievance report or from an NGO report, for example. And then there are some good tips on how to perform effective monitoring, especially focusing on engaging workers and making sure that you get information from workers to verify that in fact risks have been prevented or harm has been effectively remediated. Tool 7, very essential tool. As Ali mentioned, the process of recruiting, selecting, and hiring workers is quite often outsourced to recruitment agents, especially when workers are being recruited from another country, or to staffing agents when there's a need for workforce flexibility, for lack of a better term, where you need to quickly get somebody on site, work for a limited amount of time, and then they go back after the busy season is over or the production quota has been met. So, but when you do that, when an employer outsources the process to agents, you lose a couple of things. You lose visibility to what's going on. You lose control of the process. How do you know that what the job candidate is being told about the job is in fact what the job entails? And the risk of deception that Ali described and some of the other unethical practices that can happen when recruitment is outsourced is what we need to figure out how to address. And one way to do that, the first step, is proper screening of a recruitment agent. It makes sure that any employer, whether you're a vehicle manufacturer, a vessel operator, that you only use recruitment agents and other agents that are willing and able to practice ethical recruitment and can follow your company's or your organization's human rights requirements. So tool 7 is to ask those questions of labor providers before you engage with them. It's designed as an interviewing tool, not as something that you send in the mail and get a response back. But what are the questions that you ask an agent to know that they will follow ethical recruitment principles? It contains process focus, performance criteria that look at their risk controls and sampled indicators of good performance, for example. Essentially, all of the questions are, how do you do X? Not simply, do you not charge fees, yes or no, but how do you ensure that workers do not pay recruitment fees? And the other thing that the tool gives you are examples of red flags. What if the agent says this? It can mean that there's a gap in their process. And finally, there's a little scoring table at the end, which is flexible for use. You can change the weightings in it, for example, but it can allow you to give an overall score to a prospective recruitment agent before you actually engage with them. So that's these. Oh, I forgot to show the actual interview questions, but this is the type of questions. As I said, they're all, how do you do whatever the process is. And then there's tool 9 that I mentioned is a companion tool. So you've hired the recruitment agent, they're getting workers for you. How do you know that everything is going according to your requirements? How do you know that workers are being given truthful information about the job that they're entering into? How do you know that they're not paying fees? And so this is a fairly lengthy tool that has 7 different assessment areas. It looks at fees. It looks at contracts to make sure that workers are getting contracts that cover the accurate terms and conditions of their employment, how they're trained, both before they leave their origin country, if they're foreign workers, and what kind of training they receive when they get to the work site. Is there a grievance process in place? It's essential that a recruitment agent, a staffing agent have a grievance process available at the point of recruitment. That way, workers, if they have an issue with anything from the job posting to their mode of transportation, they're able to file an official grievance report on that. Are they paid properly? Are there any loans or deductions or deposits that could result in indebtedness of the worker? What kind of accommodation are they provided? Does it meet country requirements or international requirements, such as in ILO guidance? If they're workers that are managed by a staffing agent, what is the process for disciplining the workers, for terminating the workers? Is it again something that is legally compliant as well? Does it meet your own requirements? And then finally, um, personal identity documents. Are workers in possession of their own documents? And if not, is it something that's only done uh, for that time period when work permits have to be obtained or renewed? Or is there some other reason why they don't have their documents? So it's essentially an audit tool for agents of all kinds and can be or is essential in evaluating whether an agent is meeting your requirements. And I should mention that it cannot be used without using tool 10. And I mentioned tool 10 is the worker interview tool. Again, you can you can have an agent show you proof on paper that they did not charge recruitment fees, but it's really the worker that has to verify that, yes, in fact, I did not pay fees. So they go hand in hand. That's it for the coverage right now of the tool set. And what I want to do is transition to looking at questions that you may have posted, and hopefully we can address a number of those in the 8 or 10 minutes we have left. Go ahead,
So we
Lydia.
got one for you, Michael, that actually sort of, when you mentioned tool 10, this seemed to really cue up this question about whether any of the tools could help you identify North Korean workers being used in other countries through whatever transfer program might, or however they got there. So I thought that was a good one to start with.
Yeah, I don't know if tool 10 can help you identify if there are North Korean workers. I mean, it could certainly help you if you have the ability to engage with them, to ask them the right questions. But determining whether there are North Korean workers at an operation is part of mapping that supply chain. When you're looking at who's in your supply chain, what do they do? One of the bits of information you're trying to get is workforce demographics. Who works for you? Are they local workers? What positions are they in? Are they contracted workers? Are they foreign migrant workers? What countries are they from? How many are there? All of that. And that can help you determine how you want to do further assessment of the risks that operation may present, which obviously can include an on-site assessment, which would then involve interviewing workers. And if there are North Korean workers there, that they would certainly be among those interviewed. I don't know if that answers the question, but
I think it goes a long way to answering. Is certification of labor agencies the best answer to scaling good practices?
there are a handful of labor agent certification schemes out there now. There's the IRIS one that's run by IOM. There's On the Level. There's Clearview. They're similar in a lot of respects. They have performance criteria for labor agents that include some of the specifics that we were talking about, how you prevent employee paid fees, how you ensure that workers possess their passports. And they also have a number of requirements for the types of systems, the procedures that agencies need to have in place to make sure that they meet requirements. The problem we've had to date is, although these systems have been around for a while now, we haven't really reached critical mass where there's enough demand to really say that, oh, we can just go out and get a certified agent. If you look at a typical agent, they may have dozens or hundreds of clients. If only a handful of those are asking for them to be certified, that's probably not enough for them to go ahead and do it. So there is not, in most cases, a real financial need for them to go and become certified. They're not going to go out of business if they're not certified. So it's been a matter of lack of demand at this point. But there are valid systems out there, just not in widespread use right now. Think you muted, Lydia.
Thank you. Why don't companies just hire workers directly?
Great question. And a lot of companies have chosen that as the best way for them to manage recruitment risk. If you go back to why companies don't hire directly, it was done a lot of times for saving costs. If you can have a lot of those human resources functions managed by services provider, that those are people you don't have to have on staff. Also, if you're in the case of foreign migrant workers, if you're hiring workers from a half dozen countries, you would have to have employees that know the laws in those countries, that may be based in those countries. It can be more expensive. But what a lot of companies have found, that by hiring directly, by sending staff to an origin country when they're looking to recruit and hire people, and doing that directly, they found that it actually saves them money. They find that workers have longer tenure with the company, so training costs are lower, recruitment costs are lower if you're not having to go out and recruit and hire on a very frequent basis. And the quality of the worker is actually better, because being from the company, knowing exactly what you're looking for in terms of the skills and knowledge of that worker, you can do a better job of selecting the right person for the job.
Okay, another one, or just about out of time, but this is really kind of a comment, but I think you can speak to this. This is from somebody in New Zealand. They promote worker voice platforms and also anonymous whistleblower lines to report exploitation. It's not really a question. It's the comment is something worth exploring as part of the process. But we do have a tool about worker engagement and grievance, and maybe you can speak to that before we go.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, having widely available worker voice platforms, whether it's some way of surveying workers on a regular basis using their cell phones, or having them be able to ask questions or to submit grievances, that's great. And they're being used pretty widely in some areas, and in some they're not. It depends on the percentage of workers that have smartphones. It depends on a number of factors. But engaging workers, as I mentioned earlier, using tool 11 is key. Workers are the ones that are affected by the risks of forced labor and other human rights abuses. Therefore, engaging them to better understand those risks, better understand how to prevent and mitigate them, and to remediate any harm that's occurred is absolutely the best way for a company to operate. And a lot of companies think about worker engagement or grievance as strictly getting that grievance report and trying to go out and fix an issue. But it's an essential way of monitoring how well things are going. Just an ongoing process of gathering information about, gee, are our procedures working? So I couldn't agree more with the comment about worker voice platforms and anonymous whistleblowing systems.
That's it for time. Thank you, everybody, for joining and staying. We'd love to hear from you. There's a couple of email addresses here for comments. Also, we'll take comments on the RST site as well, and all participants will be receiving a link to the video. And I don't know the answer to whether they're getting the deck or not. Sorry. So you will be receiving the video, and we're really going to go deep dive next week on one of the things that companies have the most difficulty with, which is really starting off with a risk assessment, supply chain mapping, and starting to segment the risk that they're finding, because you can't boil the ocean. There was a question about the smaller companies. How do smaller companies get their arms around this? And being able to prioritize the risks that are identified is really key to that. And that's what we'll be covering next week. So, so big thanks to all of you for joining us, and we hope to hear from you.